Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, we're going to be talking with State Representative Luke Simons about a bill. The bill's failed now, but it's a bill that he introduced regarding privacy rights. Now, I think most of you, if I said, hey, can the cops come onto your land without a warrant? Like, if you don't invite them on and there's no emergency and there's no probable cause, can they just come onto your land and, I don't know, maybe search your shed or your barn or something without your say-so and without a warrant? I think most of you would probably say, well, no, that's unconstitutional. That's a Fourth Amendment violation. But the thing is, the Supreme Court has held up that your land is not in effect. See, the Fourth Amendment prohibits the state, from making you insecure, right? The Fourth Amendment guarantees our right to be secure in our person and effects and papers and in our home from unreasonable search and seizure. But the thing is your land, and by this I'm talking about your literal land, not your house. Your land is not your house, and in fact, it's not your effect either. And so what the courts have found is that really your right to be secure in your home only extends to about 60 feet away from your home. Beyond that, there's something called the open field doctrine, which applies, which essentially means law enforcement can just go in your barn if it's more than 60 feet away from your home, or go in your shed. They can just roll up in there and take a look. Now, Representative Simon says he sponsored this legislation because he had a personal experience where a neighbor was, making repeated calls to law enforcement claiming that he wasn't, treating his animals appropriately. Representative Simons is a rancher by trade. And so, he said that after 4 or 5 visits, he got fed up with it, and he said, hey, next time you want to come out here, come with a warrant. And the cop told him, I don't need a warrant. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Now, this bill would have required that law enforcement get this warrant or have probable cause or be responding to an emergency or be invited onto the property. Absent those things, they would have to get a warrant. But that bill, although it passed the State House by a wide margin, went down in flames in the State Senate. And I talked with Representative Simons about that. But before we get there, I wanted to talk to you about something that happened in the State House yesterday. So there was a gentleman, a Hindu leader. His name is Rajan Zed. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But Rajan Zed, he is the president of the Universal Society of Hinduism, based out of Reno, Nevada. And he came to North Dakota to deliver a Hindu invocation at the legislature. Now, if you're not familiar with this, essentially the lawmakers in Bismarck, both the House and the Senate, have sort of a rotating cast of religious leaders who deliver invocations at the beginning of each legislative session, right? So every morning, they have basically a pastor of the day. I'm not sure what they call it, but basically a religious leader of the day. And that person, before they get started with that day's floor work, that person delivers an invocation. Now, they have somebody from all sorts of different types of religions. They have Lutherans and Catholics. We've had Jewish leaders. We've had a number of them over the years. It's, like I said, it's a rotating crop. And it's been pretty inclusive in the past. But this one was a Hindu. And Representative Jeff Hoverson, a Republican from Minot, along with some other lawmakers, Representative Sebastian Ertelt of Lisbon, Representative, Luke Simons, although I interviewed him for this podcast before this happened on the floor, and Representative Daniel Johnston of Catherine, they all objected to the Hindu leader. Well, I don't want to say that they all objected. They all abstained from participating in the invocation. They all removed themselves from the floor. And the explanation from them, according to reporting from my colleague John Hageman, their explanation was essentially they didn't want to participate in a religious ceremony that they felt violated their religious conscience. Now, if this matter had ended there, I would be fine with it. I don't think that anybody has any obligation to participate in a religious ceremony if they don't want to. If these were atheists, and I should be clear here, I am an atheist. If these were atheists who had removed themselves from the floor because they didn't want to participate in a Christian invocation, I would be fine with it. That's their right. Religious freedom, and in fact, the concept of freedom and liberty in general, doesn't just include the right to say yes, it also includes the right to say no. So if you don't want to participate in something, you don't have to. And, my expectation would be that these lawmakers would remove themselves from the floor in a respectful way. If they just want to absent themselves, if they just want to not be there, well, then fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't heckle the man. Don't shout at him. Don't be distracting. Don't disturb others. Just remove yourself, wait for it to be over, and then get on with the state's business. That would be fine. If it had ended there, that would be just fine. But Representative Jeff Hoverson of Minot took it a step further. He actually objected, and this is why I corrected myself earlier, because as far as I know, Representative Ertelt, Representative Simons, Representative Johnston didn't do this, but Representative Hoverson went so far as to say that he's gonna submit a letter to legislative management, which is a panel of lawmakers, which, well, it's a committee that kind of manages the legislature, just like it says. Anyway, he says that he was going to submit a letter, and he told this to John Hageman. He's going to submit a letter stating that he was, quote, saddened that a Hindu prayer would be offered in the House. Saddened. Now, I know Representative Hoverson. He is from the same community that I am. I've spoken with him in the past. I agree with him largely. He is a big supporter of religious liberty. I know, for instance, that he doesn't believe that a baker should have to bake a cake for a homosexual wedding. He believes that is an expression of their religious liberty. They have a right to say no, and as an atheist, I agree with him. You should have the right to say no to that. If you should have the right to live your life in accordance with your religious conscience. So I don't have a problem with that at all. What I do have a problem with, though, is where we're trying to stop other people from expressing their point of view. Now, I don't think that there are many people of the Hindu faith in North Dakota, but I'm guessing there probably are some. And so if one day at the legislative session we want to have a Hindu leader deliver the invocation and maybe a little bit of exposure to the faith, to the spiritual beliefs of that minority of North Dakotans, well, then I think that's a positive thing. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very inclusive thing. In fact, I spend a lot of time arguing against my fellow atheists and some others about the whole idea of the separation of church and state doctrine, right? I mean, that's a familiar term. We've all heard that term, and usually it's invoked when we're saying, well, we can't allow prayer in school, and we can't allow prayer at football games, and we can't do this, and we can't do that. And I've never liked that formulation, right? I understand that the First Amendment makes it clear that the state cannot establish a religion. And from that, it's my understanding, my firm belief, that the state has no business favoring one religion over another. But rather than that meaning we should drive all religion from the public square, I think that we should invite all religion into the public square, which means that, well, if you're going to allow time to pray at school or whatever, then you allow all prayers, right? If you're Hindu, if you're Muslim, if you're Buddhist, if you're Jewish, what have you, everybody's allowed to pray, and they can pray how they want. You just got to treat everybody equally. And I think our society is richer if we invite everybody in. Everybody bring it in with you. Right? If you're Hindu, if you're, whatever it is you are, bring it all in with you. That's great. Right? That to me, that's inclusion. I think in the past, we've ironically, for the sake of inclusion, we have been very exclusive when it comes to religion, mostly because, Christianity is sort of the majority, right? Most Americans are Christian, and so Christianity is sort of the dominant religion, and so most of the time when we're driving religious expression out of the public square, historically, it's mostly been Christian expression. Just by dint of the fact that most people practicing religion in the United States of America are Christian. But I'd rather go the other way. I'd rather invite it all in, which is why I don't understand somebody like Representative Hoverson, who claims to support religious liberty, would go so far as to say that he objects to somebody of a different religion basically expressing themselves before the legislature by invitation. Now, again, this was by invitation. I mean, the legislature agreed to this. This wasn't just some guy who showed up and started doing a prayer, randomly. He was invited to do this. He was allowed to do this. This was the sanctioned invocation of the day. It wasn't disruptive. There was nothing wrong with it. Why is Representative Hoverson objecting to this? The only grounds he has to object is that's just a religion he doesn't personally subscribe to, which is, well, it's not legitimate grounds through which to object. Not in particular for somebody who claims to support religious liberty. Now, Representative Hoverson is Representative Hoverson is a freshman lawmaker. He was just elected to District 3. The person he replaced in the House is former State Representative Roscoe Striley. He wrote on Twitter, I quote, "My District 3 Representative Jeff Hoverson is an absolute disgrace. It took him less than one session to become the laughingstock of the legislature and a complete embarrassment to Minot. A man of, quote, God, he claims. A joke of a man is more like it." Now, those are some harsh words. But I can understand why Striley is frustrated. Again, Republicans spend a lot of time fighting for religious freedom. And that's a good thing. Even though I'm personally not religious, even though personally I'm atheist, I want people, I think it's a constitutional right, I want people to be able to express themselves, but all people. And one thing that I detest is people trying to force their point of view on others. And that's what Representative Hoverson is doing. Now, he would object if we're talking about, people who believe in homosexual marriage, as I do, forcing him, to live his life in accordance with that, right? Forcing him to, personally attend a gay wedding. If Representative Hoverson didn't want to go to that, I don't think anybody should force him. And I don't think anybody should have been forced to listen to a Hindu prayer in the legislature today. And in fact, they weren't. Several lawmakers, including Hoverson, chose not to participate. That's fine. That's their right. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't have a problem with it at all. But to object to the invocation even happening, well, it's disappointing to say the least. My interview with Representative Simons, coming up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. State Representative Luke Simons is the sponsor of House Bill 1290. Now, what House Bill 1290 was, and I say was because the bill is no more. It's been killed in the Senate chamber despite passing by a pretty wide margin in the House earlier this year. What the bill was is it would have prohibited law enforcement entry onto private land without permission. Now, if law enforcement wanted to enter land without permission, they would be able to with a warrant or with probable cause that a violation of law has occurred, or if they were responding to an emergency situation, like maybe, an accident or a fire or something like that. So under those conditions, they could still enter. But otherwise, if they wanted to get on land, they would need permission. Now, you would think that this sort of policy would be unnecessary, right? Most of us are pretty familiar with the Fourth Amendment and its requirement that we be secure in our, quote, persons, houses, papers, and effects from, quote, unreasonable searches and seizures. But the thing is that your land is not your house, and the courts have found that it's not your effect either. The federal courts have ruled that searches outside of a property owner's curtilage. Now, if you're wondering what that means, that's the area immediately surrounding your domicile, your residence. In North Dakota, I think that's defined as about 60 feet. Once you're outside of that, your land's pretty much open to law enforcement and even structures on that land. So think of something like maybe a barn or an outbuilding. If law enforcement wants to get into it and it's more than 60 feet away from their house, they pretty much don't need a warrant. Now, Representative Simons, that's the problem. That's the, dare I say, loophole that you set out to fix with this bill.
That's correct. Yes. Just simply giving country folks the same right as city people have. That's all we were trying to do with this bill.
Now, you had a personal experience which led you to introduce this bill. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. I was feeding hay-bit barley to my cows, and my cows are kind of, I don't know, I kind of spoil them, I guess. And from the road, hay-bit barley sometimes is more of a yellowish color instead of green like you would picture hay. But hay-bit barley has the same feed value as like alfalfa, for example, which is some of the best hay you can buy. And Busybody was driving up and down the road and called the sheriff and said, Luke is feeding his cows straw, which was not true. So the sheriff came out. I took him through the cows, showed him, and all the cows were fat and sassy. All my girls are fat. And after about the fourth or fifth time, I told the sheriff, I'm not playing this game anymore. You can come back out with a search warrant. Because go ahead.
He came out, the sheriff came out responding to a complaint from someone, came out 4 times, 5 times?
Yes.
And
somewhere right in there.
And each time wanted to come on your property.
Yep.
Now,
just looked at the cows quick.
Now those 4 or 5 times, did you gave permission all the times? I'm assuming you gave him like a tour of your cattle. I mean, is that's what happened those other times?
Yes, I was accompanied with him.
And then finally you said, hey, I've you've been out here plenty. My cows are fine. If you're not, if you want to come out anymore, get a search warrant. That's what you said. And he told you essentially, I don't need one?
That's exactly what he told me. And the time I was young, so I thought he was full of beans. And I told him, I said, well, I'd like to see anybody try to come out here without a search warrant. And he couldn't see the cows from the road. That was the other thing. And he said, listen, I don't need a search warrant to come on your land. Open fields doctrine. Well, that was the first time I ever heard the language open fields doctrine. And that's how it started. And I thought he was full of hot beans. And it turns out he was correct. You don't have Fourth Amendment rights if you live in the country 60 feet from your home. Period.
Your bill says, essentially, I'm going to quote now from the bill. This is, as it was originally introduced, House Bill 1290. It said, I quote, notwithstanding any other provision of law and subject to subsection 3, and that's the exemptions for probable cause, a search warrant, or responding to an emergent situation, a law enforcement officer may not enter private land unless the law enforcement officer receives permission from the landowner or a lessee of the land. And then further in the bill, Section 4 says any property or contraband seized by a law enforcement officer in violation of subsection 2, which is what I just read, may not be used as evidence against the defendant in any criminal proceeding. So basically, this is, if you want to come on the land, get a warrant or have probable cause.
Or permission.
Or permission, correct. So this bill passed pretty handily in the House. I mean, it was 64 to 29. That was the vote total back in February. How did the debate go in the House? I mean, did it require a lot of convincing? Was this a heavy lift for you on the House side?
No, it actually just went exactly like I expected it would. People were shocked, absolutely shocked. Then later on in committee, they called in other attorneys other than the ones I provided, and were even more shocked to find out that everything I said was exactly true. Your outbuildings, your grain bins, your barns, your Quonsets, your shops, all of them do not need a search warrant. If a sheriff gets a search warrant to check a building 60 feet from your curtilage, from your home, he is being courteous because he does not need one according to statute.
Now, it passed easily in the House, but it went over to the Senate side, and just recently it failed on a 4-43 vote. Now, the Senate Judiciary Committee, first of all, they hoghoused your bill. They took out all the language I just read and instead turned it into a study. Then the study came to the floor. It got just 4 yes votes. What happened in the Senate, Luke?
I'm not quite sure. Now, there were a couple of people that really kind of fought for it in the committee, and they did the same thing we did. They brought in legal staff from the Capitol and drilled them and found out everything I said was 100% true. And your buildings, your what you would assume your Fourth Amendment rights are, aren't covered in the country. However, what they did have, and it was this same bill, the chair lady heard 2 bills of similar nature together. My bill was first, and then civil asset forfeiture was right after that. and law enforcement packed the room. And what really disturbed me is how the state's attorneys and law enforcement flat out lied about my bill. And it was flat out lies, which they proved later on in committee. Now, what's interesting is it did get hoghoused, like you said, but it got a 4-2 due pass. And then the bill carrier on the floor asked for a red vote. So just interesting to me. Real interesting.
Well, it's worth pointing out that the bill carrier. Well, who was the bill carrier? The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee is Senator Diane Larson, and she worked for the Bismarck Police Department, and so perhaps her sympathies, her biases. I think sometimes when you look at it, the way a lot of these bills dealing with law enforcement, how they're treated in the Senate, I think a lot of them maybe have to do with Senator Larson's biases. Who carried the bill to the floor?
I believe he's a Bismarck legislator. He's from, when is he? Larry Clemene and George Kaiser's senator. Diane
Larson?
I can't pronounce his name.
Oh.
No,
okay.
It was a gentleman.
Okay, well, we can look that up. That's unimportant. So basically, despite getting a due pass recommendation, the bill carrier asked for a red vote. And, again, at that point, it was just a study, which was unfortunate because, frankly, I thought that your language was pretty good, but it died on the Senate floor. Now, what's interesting is Luke, you drew a distinction here and said that you wanted to give country folks the same right as city folks because for most people who live in cities, your curtilage is probably about as big as your lot. If you're living in town, you get 60 feet away from your house. It's probably the edge of your property line anyway. But I mean, that's not necessarily true of everywhere, right? I mean, you don't necessarily have to live in the country. You don't have to be a rancher or a farmer to be affected by this. If you have a lake cabin where your shed is 60 feet away from your home, it's pretty much open season for law enforcement on that shed. If they want to go in there and poke around, they can.
That is correct. There's nowhere anywhere in statute saying they cannot. So you're exactly right. It's not just for farmers and ranchers. It's anybody that lives in the country. Period.
What I think is interesting because law enforcement gets up in arms, and first of all, I think they get a little defensive, and I want to be sympathetic. My dad was a cop. I understand what a tough job it was. I've not been a cop, but I mean, listen, I lived with the guy. I know how hard a job it was, and it still is. So I want to be sympathetic to it, and I think sometimes they get defensive because they get beat up all the time. They're dealing with the general public, usually at our worst moments, right? I mean, it's rare that a law enforcement officer deals with happy people during their job. If the cops have showed up, something has gone wrong, and that's their job. And I understand why they're defensive. I can understand that mindset sometimes, but what I don't understand is why they choose these hills to die on. Why not it's not that hard to get a warrant. It really isn't. In a situation like yours where somebody's made an accusation of animal neglect, it's not that hard to go to a judge and say, listen, we've got this person. They've made an accusation. We'd like to go check it out. We asked for permission from the property owner. They're not giving it, but we have reason to believe these animals are being neglected. The judge is going to sign off on that. They're not that hard to get. Why wouldn't, just for the sake of, hey, let's get along and respect everybody's rights, why not get a warrant?
That's exactly how I felt. I felt like it was just a simple, that was easy, push the button concept. It takes, in committee, it came out, the average search warrant takes 15 to 20 minutes to get. So we're not talking about anything.
By the way, they don't even necessarily have to have like a hearing. I mean, you can get a warrant by like email, right? Like you email it over, the judge signs off on it, emails it back. It's with modern technology, it's not like they have to like rush down to the courthouse and get a judge out of bed or something like that. That's not how it works.
Right. That's exactly it. Basically a rubber stamp. Your vehicle in North Dakota is covered under effects. So your tractor, any motorized vehicle, is considered motor effects. So you can have your pickup, you can have your side-by-side, you can have your tractors, your combine, all in a building, and those are protected under the Fourth Amendment. However, under effects. However, the building it is in is not covered. Go figure that one out. And, and a lot of people just don't think about this. They're like, I have nothing to hide. Why would I be worried about this? And you have to remember where we came from. We came from tyranny. We literally declared our independence from England over this concept of unreasonable searches and seizures, and among others, but this is one of them. You don't just have the right to search my person, and that's exactly what it means in the Fourth Amendment. My person, which means my personal luggage, which means my backpack, which means a lady's purse, etc. You don't have the right to search it without a warrant, permission, or reasonable cause. And reasonable cause is 51%. That's what it is. 50%, they don't have reasonable cause. 49%, they don't have reasonable cause. It has to be reasonable cause for them to be able to do this. So, and
even that's honestly not that high of a standard, Luke. I mean, if you think about it, probable cause, really not that hard. It's not. I mean, I know what you're saying, but it's not that high of a standard. I wanted to circle back on something you said, that the state's attorneys, basically that's what we call prosecutors here in North Dakota, and law enforcement flat out lied about your bill. What did they say? We never got to that.
They said this doesn't happen. I've got most of it recorded, actually, but and obviously it's a recorded conversation anyways, but they said this doesn't happen here, but it does happen here. We have two cases that went to the Supreme Court from North Dakota, one in 1984 and one in 1960-ish something, which I have a complete copy of. And it's happening all the time, particularly under animal cruelty. Officers are just, it happened in Dickinson. I gave this in our testimony. A veterinarian was called by the local sheriff department because a horse was allegedly being neglected. Actually, I don't know who this happened to. I could find out very quickly. The veterinarian himself told me. And they went to the house, no horse in the corral, no horse in the pasture. And they knocked on the door. And the person was at work. So the sheriff or the deputy walked right over to the barn, opened the barn door. The veterinarian said, sorry, this is where it ends for me. He said, why? He said, because you don't have a search warrant. He said, we don't need one. We have open fields doctrine. We can walk in here. And the veterinarian refused. So the sheriff got a rubber stamped search warrant, took the horse out. Turned out the horse was Arabian by breed, and it wasn't neglected at all. The horse was in fine shape. But it happens all the time. I literally have a dozen cases on my desk in Dickinson, just that happen around in my counties.
And honestly, I think that the argument that it does or doesn't happen, I think is irrelevant. I don't feel like our rights to things like privacy need to hinge on the forbearance of the state, right? So I don't think you can't say that it doesn't matter if your rights are not protected by law in this instance because we'd never do that to you. Well, they're not going to do it to you until they do, and then they show up. Also, if they're not doing it, then what's the big deal about your bill? Why defeat your bill? If it's not happening, then great. Your bill should sail through because it's not going to change a thing.
You know, that's funny because Representative Terry Jones was sitting right beside me. And as we heard from one deputy or sheriff from another, why we shouldn't have this, he said, Luke, they're making our case. He said, they're saying that this would be wrong for them to do that. We don't do that. They made our case 100%. Then the Petroleum Council got up and they said, well, we wouldn't even be able to walk on someone's land to check like, what do they call it? Pipelines and et cetera, or oil wells. That's not true. Under existing contract, electric companies come and check your meter. and right on your land all the time.
Yeah.
Another deputy came up and said, we wouldn't even be able to do a search, or not a search warrant, but serve papers on somebody, which is not true, because in North Dakota, you have the right to drive on a section line. You also have a right to drive on an established road. So that is not true. There was a lot of misunderstandings, but if you read the bill, it's just simply putting into statute Fourth Amendment rights for what I call a second-class citizen, which are people that don't live in cities, that don't have Fourth Amendment rights 60 feet from their home.
I will tell you, I used to serve civil process, and you don't need open field doctrine to serve civil process. And the rest of that, I mean, that can be addressed with easements. I mean, that's very easy to address. If you need access to a pipeline or something, it's easy to get an easement for maintenance or what have you. I mean, you don't need open fields doctrine for that. So anyway, it's an interesting debate. Luke, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And just last question: Are you thinking about an initiated measure or bringing this back in future sessions? I'm not sure this is a debate that should just go away.
It's not going to go away. If I'm reelected, even if I'm not reelected, I will make sure that a liberty-minded person takes this bill on. So it is not going away. Right now, what I'm trying to do is just letting people know what is happening. Most people do not know that they do not have Fourth Amendment rights for their outbuildings. That's a fact. One other point quickly, the Game and Fish Department said they would no longer be able to conduct their business because they couldn't walk on somebody's land. That's not true. If you hear a rifle go off, if you see somebody hunting or even driving through a field, they're not supposed to be driving through fields during hunting season, period.
Right.
Therefore, you have probable cause. So it was just a mess what law enforcement did. And I am sympathetic with law enforcement. I was a reserve deputy for some time. I back the badge if they back the Constitution, period. So I like how you brought that out too. They do feel like they're attacked a lot, but they're not attacked by me. All I want is due process.
Luke, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Rob. Keep it up.
That's it for today's podcast, but before we end, I got an email from Chris. He says, I quote, I just listened to your podcast about the hair braider moving to Minnesota due to North Dakota regulations. Has anyone ever mentioned North Dakota regulations regarding massage therapy? North Dakota is way over-regulated in that field, too. Chris, you could be right. I don't know that much about the licensing requirements or the regulations for massage therapy specifically, but I will say that in general, I think North Dakota, we go a little too far in occupational licensing. I think that we're constantly struggling to, diversify our economy. We want people to move here. We want people to start businesses here. That would be great for the state. But yet, I think occupational licensing in some ways is used by established businesses, entrenched industries to stop competition. Once you're in a business, right, once you've overcome the hurdles, well, you don't really want other people to overcome those hurdles and start competing with you, right? I mean, I think if you look closely, some of the biggest advocates to the issue of occupational licensing, the biggest advocates for the licensing regulations are people who are already in the business. Sometimes people who, by the way, didn't ever have to comply to those occupational licensing, regulations in the first place because they were established after they were in business and they got grandfathered in, right? So it's like they won the race and now they want to declare the race over. Well, it shouldn't be that way. Chris, thanks for the feedback. By the way, if you want to send feedback to the show, you can certainly do that. Email rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can send questions to our weekly guest, Senator Kevin Cramer, Congressman Kelly Armstrong, to that address as well. Follow me on social media at Rob Port on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. I'm Rob Port. Say Anything Blog has accounts on Facebook and Twitter as well. Follow those. If you do follow, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.